Hello everyone, this is Bob Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Something I've advocated for in previous videos is the use of additional time periods when creating speculative settings. Medieval Europe does have its advantages and an interesting mix of cultures and conflicts, but it doesn't have to be the default background of a fantasy campaign. And while the future is the most logical place to set a science fiction story, there is some merit to creating a fantastical, yet grounded in science story set several hundred years ago. So what this video is going to look at are all of the conflicts and setups that each historical era can offer a setting creator, and the various reasons why each era is worth choosing. And before I begin, I should admit that this will be a very Eurocentric view of historical eras, also because my knowledge of history is also very Eurocentric. I should also add that I see nothing wrong with mixing and matching aspects of different eras, and so if your setting is mostly similar to Renaissance England, you can still draw ideas for conflicts from what I present in, say, the Stone Age and the Industrial Age sections. The point of this video is inspiration, not limitation. And with that all cleared up, let's begin. Stone Age. The Stone Age is generally considered to cover the dawn of Homo sapiens sapiens and continue right up to early agriculture and semi-sedentary societies, around which point smelting was invented and the Bronze Age began. Not much is known about this period, but what we do know is that people didn't live in caves and communicate in grunts. Both complex language and the idea of building shelters were well established by the time modern humans developed. What's notable about this time is that there were no serious conflicts yet between humans. Tribes would certainly fight each other and take each other's things, but without any permanent homes to protect and a low population density, a tribe that got abused too often could simply pack up their things and go somewhere new. Instead, the major conflicts of the era were with nature. Aggressive predators were still high in density and dangerous even when encountered in small groups. A sudden flood could doom an entire tribe, and if the hunters and gatherers failed to bring anything home, everyone would starve. Humans without technology were at the mercy of the world around them. Bronze Age. The invention of bronze made it much easier to create strong and durable tools, and in particular it made sustained agriculture much easier to manage. This period also saw the invention of writing, the ability to set ideas and stories in a physical form, and this improved both invention speed and cultural transmission. The Bronze Age saw the development of the very first empires, times when a certain tribe or culture would rise up to dominate its neighbors and force them to pay tribute in exchange for peace and protection. This era also produced the first written laws and religious documents, and at the time, there was no real difference between the two. The forces of nature were still very dangerous and unpredictable, and humans invented many gods to try and understand and placate these forces. A conflict in the Bronze Age could be based around an expanding empire, or it could center on a battle between gods, and the increasingly complex religions that are forming around them. Or you could draw inspiration from one of the classic Bronze Age heroes, like Gilgamesh, Heracles, or Samson, people who probably existed in one form or another, but whose legends have been exaggerated beyond all recognition. Early Iron Age. A widespread collapse at the end of the Bronze Age saw the rise of a new set of societies, and with them came the rise of new technologies like ironworking, larger and safer ships, and saddles that allowed people to ride on horseback. New agricultural techniques caused a population explosion, and new transportation technologies allowed these populations to spread further than ever. In particular, the Mediterranean Sea became dominated by the Greeks and the Phoenicians, and empires like Persia and Egypt grew bigger than ever before. By this point, writing was becoming common enough that individuals were having their actual deeds recorded instead of their legends, although the line between the two was still blurry at best. This was also the time when cities were starting to experiment with different government types, such as the democratic Athenians and the militaristic Spartans. And some cultures were spreading new religious ideas like Zoroastrian dualism, Hebrew monotheism, and Buddhist compassion. Conflicts can center around the clash of empires, the emergence of conflicting religious ideas, or the distrust between colonists and natives. Classical Age. The time period covered by the Classical Age can depend on whom you ask, but for the purposes of this list, I'm starting it with the rise of the Greeks under Alexander, and ending it with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In many ways, the Classical Age has the same sort of conflicts as the early Iron Age, But this period also adds things like new combat techniques that make empire building much faster, and a growing emphasis on cultural and religious assimilation that wasn't fully present before. Imperial cultures were always happy to force their subjects to pay them taxes and tributes, but during the classical period, they also felt the need to make their subjects act like them. In addition, the classical age introduces new societal conflicts, like systemic religious persecution, underground resistance movements against more persistent empires, and of course, civil wars that would first convert Rome to an autocracy, and then slowly tear it apart. Barbarian Kingdoms Age. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, a set of so-called barbarian tribes rose up to fill the power vacuum. The tribes had a much looser grasp on politics and administration than the Romans had, and between that and the constant fighting, both between and within the tribes, a lot of the technology and infrastructure built by the Romans was lost. This was a time when empires quickly rose and fell, thanks to divisive inheritance traditions and arguments between brothers, and it was a time when Arabs would conquer most of the Middle East, North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula. As you might imagine, conflicts both big and small were constant throughout this period. Just about anyone with a bit of charisma and an army could carve out a new kingdom or take over an old one. There were also divisions between old paganist religions and new organized religions, and while paganism was on the wane, it was less because of technology or cultural advantages, and more because people would convert to organized religions, and not convert to pagan religions. Middle Ages. The Middle Ages saw new developments in armor, weapons, fortifications, and even some automation like windmills and water wheels. It also saw the social order of Europe stabilize as kings and nobles formalized their relationships and came up with less chaotic inheritance laws. The Middle Ages were also the dawn of international coalitions, as Muslim and Christian nations banded together to fight over the Levant and other territories. Conflict in the late Middle Ages was far more technical and intricate compared to earlier periods, both in terms of arms and armor, and in terms of sieges and strategies. This era also saw the dawn of courtly intrigue as we understand it today. People would certainly poison and stab each other in earlier times, but as inheritance laws and feudal obligations got more complicated, subtlety became a much more useful trait. This was also the time of the Black Death, and the great social upheaval that followed it, an upheaval that led directly to the Renaissance. Renaissance. War technology went through a big change as cannons took over sieges and firearms became relatively fast and reliable. At the same time, new ship designs were letting Europeans travel halfway around the world, and a few short decades later they managed to cross the world completely. This new range of transportation made a few nations filthy rich, both by connecting them to formerly distant markets and by giving them a chance to topple a few unstable empires and install themselves as the new rulers. But all of this international trade wasn't just bringing new goods to Europe, it was also bringing new ideas, not to mention a few old ideas recovered from Muslim lands that had never lost them. New technologies were being invented at a previously unseen pace, and new philosophies were spreading faster than the old Christian churches could stamp them out. People were also beginning to identify with their nations, and not just their cultures and religions, and that led to the rise of nation-states, with a set of increasingly stable borders. Conflict in the Renaissance, or Age of Sail, is remarkable in its variety. You've got courtly intrigue, vicious wars over land, religion, and leadership, adventure on the high seas, explorers visiting the far corners of the globe, empires rising and falling, religions in conflict, and a strange mix of weapons and armor as firearms become common but still aren't a main battlefield weapon. Enlightenment Age. By the Enlightenment Age, science had advanced far enough that humans had a solid understanding of nature, and so people began to question the need for religion and gods. Changing social pressures also led to the birth of representative democracy and liberalism, while at the same time the concentration of wealth and technology in European hands led to empire building and some of the worst human tragedies the planet has ever seen. For conflicts, the Enlightenment Age was an era of revolutions, colonialism, mass enslavement, and decadent empires ready to fall under their own weight. Firearms and battlefield cannons had made armor obsolete, and so combat instead centered on mass fusillades and personal duels. Courtly intrigue was at an all-time high, but out on the frontier, life was a lot more straightforward, dangerous, and yet potentially rewarding. Industrial Age. Technology hit a turning point during the Enlightenment Age, and the Industrial Age is when that turn became noticeable. Mechanical automation and reliable replication were making a lot of goods much easier to make and cheaper, and this both improved the lives of the lower classes and enriched a new class of owners and entrepreneurs. Ideas and philosophies were becoming just as important as nations and religions, important enough to die for, and so these new ideas brought on a new set of wars and revolutions. Automation also led to urbanization, and to cities that couldn't handle the population density and so suffered from disease outbreaks, crime sprees, massive fires, and poor building maintenance. New inventions and new companies were entirely unregulated, and so they could poison their customers and pollute the landscape without so much as a slap on the wrist. Meanwhile, the European powers were busy carving up the last parts of the globe that they didn't yet own or influence. The Industrial Age is the first era that we today would recognize as being modern, and so a lot of our modern-day conflicts can easily take place in a setting based on this time period. I'm talking industry versus environment, fascism versus communism, unions versus management, inventors fighting over patents, soldiers breaking down from the horrors of war, Wild West justice, bank heists, casino heists, and so on. Atomic Age. The Atomic Age stretches from World War II up through the 70s or 80s, depending on which milestones you prefer. War in this age undergoes a massive shift as atomic weapons propagate and the various great powers can no longer afford to go directly to war with one another. Instead, the global powers focus on proxy wars, on spreading their influence without spreading their national borders. And meanwhile, the old colonial powers are releasing their former colonies, sometimes willingly, and sometimes after an extended revolution. Because of the shift from open war to Cold War, spy games become a much more visible and glamorous sort of conflict compared to the battlefield. This era also saw a second wave of social conflicts that were first seen in the Industrial Age. Conflicts like the Civil Rights Movement, Second Wave Feminism, and the Indian Independence Movement. Information Age. This is today's era, and you could say that the Information Age began with the invention of the microchip, the propagation of the personal computer, or else the fall of the Soviet Union. Today's world is defined by things like internet connections, developments in robotics, video game development, and information control. Automation is reaching the point where the best new jobs are all in content creation and other creative endeavors, and yet the older generations who are used to more physical labor or corporate life are failing to understand the recent changes in the job market. Meanwhile, the changes made to the environment during the past two eras are coming home to roost in this one, leading to increasingly dramatic natural disasters that we may be able to adapt to, but only if we manage to reverse some of the damage done. And meanwhile, targeted news and advertisements have led to the rise of echo chambers and a new resurgence of fascism throughout the developed world. I don't really have to come up with a list of conflicts for this one, since all you have to do is look around and you'll see them. Future Ages. The future is not set in stone, and the trials and conflicts we will face in it are unknown to everyone. But this is a video series about speculative fiction, so why should you let a little something like the unknown stop you? One way to imagine a future setting is to take a possible conflict based on a promising technology and center your setting or your story around it. Another is to take a minor but growing issue and magnify it. You could also take the view that history repeats itself, which it does to some extent, and so bring in conflicts and issues from previous eras and combine them with existing or speculative technologies. Yet another option is to have civilization end in some major way, and speculate on how the survivors would manage to put the world back together. In some ways, setting your story in the future gives you more options than setting it in a fantasy world. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.